Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture on Absolutism in Central and Eastern Europe. Yet another lecture as part of Unit 3, Section 7, which is our huge section on Absolutism. So today's lecture is in three parts. The first part is a brief overview of Eastern Europe, since we really haven't spent any time yet discussing Eastern Europe in this course, even though we're already about 2 centuries into modern history. So you might want to refer back to this map that you see here, actually, as I discuss some of these empires, especially Poland, Lithuania, Old Russia, and the Ottomans. So you can always go back and for a reference to see how big they are geographically on this map. Our objective for this first section is to explain the context in which different forms of political power developed from 1648 to 1815. So that's why we're going to be going back a little bit farther in history and talking about what's happening in Eastern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. We've got several key concepts for this section. The first one, different models of political sovereignty affected the relationship among states and between states and individuals. The second one, after 1648, dynastic and state interests, along with Europe's expanding colonial empires, influenced the diplomacy of European states and frequently led to war. Number 3, after the Austrian defeat of the Turks in 1683 at the Battle of Vienna, the Ottomans ceased their westward expansion. And the last one, the inability of the Polish monarchy to consolidate its authority over the nobility led to Poland's partition by Prussia, Russia, and Austria, and its disappearance from the map of Europe. We will talk about Poland more in later units as well, but one of the things I always like to say about Poland is that it is this magical country that keeps disappearing and reappearing on the map of Europe, and we will start to learn about that today. And the major theme for this section is political states and other institutions of power. So to provide some overall context, as we are moving out of the late medieval era of the 14th century and even the 15th and 16th centuries, and then moving into the 17th and 18th century, we're seeing a transition in the empires that dominate Central and Eastern Europe. So you can think of them as three aging empires: the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Polish Kingdom, also sometimes called the Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth, and then the three rising empires, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. So the acronym you can also consider for this is HOP and RAP. HOP is the older empires, RAP is the newer empires. So like I said, there are these three aging empires, the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Polish Kingdom, that will give way to the new empires of Russia, Austria, and Prussia. So we're going to take a moment to talk a little bit about each of these empires. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time on the Holy Roman Empire because we have been learning about its history quite extensively in recent units. But just as a quick reminder, the Holy Roman Empire saw lots of religious divisions due to the Reformation and religious wars in the 16th and 17th centuries. And this really split up the empire among Catholic, Lutheran, and Calvinist princes. This caused lots of decentralization in the Holy Roman Empire. That's a big thing to see. And especially the 30 Years' War severely weakened the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs as the Holy Roman emperors, though they still continued to hold that essentially powerless position. But the Treaty of Westphalia really began the decline of the Holy Roman Empire as an institution. It exacerbated the decentralization of the empire and empowered German princes. So really, we don't talk about the Holy Roman Empire much past the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, although the Holy Roman Empire technically will continue to exist until the early 19th century when it is finally dissolved by Napoleon. But that's just the biggest thing to remember, is like the Holy Roman Empire had its moment, but the Reformation basically tore it apart. So let's spend a little bit more time looking at the Ottoman Empire because we haven't had a chance to really discuss them in any depth. So the Ottoman Empire, you might remember, was a Turkish empire based in the Middle East. It had expanded into the Byzantine Empire throughout the Middle Ages and eventually conquered the city of Constantinople, which of course brought an end to the Byzantine Empire. The Ottomans from there continued to expand into southeastern Europe, into the Balkan region, where they were actually a pretty serious threat to Europe in the 16th century. But the Ottoman Empire had also expanded into the Middle East and into northern Africa. And really, by the time we get to the 17th century, it was clear that it could not maintain its possessions in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, especially in the face of Austrian and Russian expansion, these new empires. So, as I said, the Ottoman Empire was built on expansion, and the Ottoman Empire was ruled by a sultan who had absolute power in the empire. So, yes, you could think of the Ottoman Empire as similar to an absolute monarchy. But after 1560, the decline in its western expansion would result in the gradual disintegration of the empire. Now, the most famous sultan, the most powerful sultan, was someone named Suleiman the Magnificent. And really, this is the only sultan you should have to remember about the Ottoman Empire. And he was so successful that under his leadership, the Ottomans nearly conquered Austria in 1529. I mean, they were knocking on the gates of Vienna. And this was one of the reasons Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, was so distracted fighting the Ottomans, because he really had quite the formidable opponent in Suleiman. Also, under Suleiman's leadership, they captured Belgrade, which is modern-day Serbia, and ultimately about half of Eastern Europe, including all the Balkan territories, most of Hungary, and even part of southern Russia. So here you can see a graphic that shows you more or less the extent of the Ottoman Empire, especially at its height. And you can see that it did consume the entire Balkan Peninsula, getting all the way up to Vienna. Some historians actually argue that the Ottomans are one of the biggest reasons the Reformation was successful, that it was the printing press and it was the Ottomans, because they kept Charles V distracted. Yeah, hi, Bowie, yes. Sorry, Bowie is hanging out with me today. Okay, so a couple of things to know about the Ottoman Empire is the Ottomans, when there's all this territory they occupied in southern Europe, they would actually take talented Christian children from their conquered provinces and incorporate them into the Ottoman Empire's bureaucracy, or they became some type of professional that could serve the empire. This was a pretty common practice. It's not necessarily slavery, but it's also wasn't entirely voluntary, if you catch my drift. One of the most famous elements of the Ottoman Empire was something called the Janissary Corps. And these were Christian slaves who were not selected for the bureaucracy, but instead they loyally served the Turkish army. So these were children that were essentially given over to the Ottoman Empire by their families and trained to become really these powerful and really talented warriors. This was a big factor in the Ottomans' success. And it was considered an honor and a privilege to be part of the Janissary Corps. Also, one cool thing about the Ottoman Empire is that it was actually fairly tolerant regarding religion in its conquered provinces, actually much more so than most European states in the 15th and 16th century. But when it failed to conquer Vienna in 1683, its decline in Eastern Europe accelerated pretty quickly after that. Moving on to the Polish Kingdom, which is also sometimes referred to as the Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth. The reason for this is that Poland and Lithuania were actually two different regions. If you go back to the map at the beginning of this section, you'll see that it was actually a huge chunk of territory in Eastern Europe. Now, Poland and Lithuania had been joined through royal marriage in the 14th century, but the cultures remained distinct. And as we got into the 15th, 16th, and even to some extent the 17th centuries, This region was one of the largest and most populous territories in Eastern Europe, and it was also very diverse and very tolerant. However, it had some really profound weaknesses, such as the liberum veto. The liberum veto was this very strange political practice that was unique to the Polish kingdom, where voting in the Polish parliament had to be unanimous for changes to be made. Thus, little could be done to systematically strengthen the kingdom. And therefore, it really became known sort of as a republic of the nobility. We had this really weak king who was elected by nobles, and basically the king had very reduced power, and the nobility controlled the legislature. So as you can see, this is like, I guess it's technically a kingdom, but the king is even weaker than they would be in a constitutional monarchy. This was really a state and a system that empowered the nobility, but also it wasn't as effective as the government in England. There's much, much different here. This is actually a really inefficient political system that weakens Poland significantly and contributes to its demise. Here is a pretty cool graphic, actually, where you can see the geography of Poland, and again, what part of it's former Poland or Lithuania, and this other region called Ruthenia. And on the bottom, I really like how you can actually see that magic ability for Poland to disappear and reappear in the map of Europe. There's actually two events we refer to as the partition of Poland throughout history. We briefly touch on one of them in today's lecture, but we'll talk about it more as we get further into 18th century history in future lectures. But this slide might be useful to come back to, especially the maps on the bottom, to sort of understand the political progression of Poland, which, while it's not a popular subject, it can sometimes come up on the AP. Okay, another major event that contributed to the decline of the Polish kingdom was this event called the Deluge. And it is basically this huge Cossack uprising in the mid 17th century. Cossacks were these nomadic farmer warriors in Eastern Europe. We'll hear a lot about them as we talk about Eastern European history. And they had provided a military buffer against the Ottoman Turks. And they had this basically massive uprising against the Polish government. They sided with Russia as they invaded Poland, Lithuania in the mid 17th century. Sweden also got in on the game because Sweden's actually a pretty powerful state at this time too, to seize parts of Poland. And this was actually a huge revolt that greatly contributed to the overall decline of Poland. And as you can see, the population declined as much as 40% as a result of this uprising, which really became like a civil war combined with help from Russia and Sweden, trying to invade Poland. So major urban centers were in economic ruin. Like this really destroyed the Polish economy and whatever government that they had. So the inability of the Polish monarchy to consolidate its power over the nobility is ultimately what would lead to Poland's partition. So like I said, the political system weakened Poland. This event, the Deluge, weakened Poland. But fundamentally, it was really like the nobility undermined Poland throughout all of this. Russia and Prussia, which is a new empire we'll talk about shortly, encouraged certain members of the Polish nobility to invoke this policy of the liberum veto to continue to weaken the country. And this allowed Poland essentially to be partitioned and carved up like a pie and divided up between the three new empires of Eastern Europe, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, to the point where Poland will cease to exist. That's why we call it this magical country that disappears and reappears on the map of Europe. It's a really strange history. There's no other country in Europe that's going to have a history quite like this, as we will see. So that's also one of the reasons that Poland can be really a quite fascinating topic to study. Okay, moving on now to some characteristics of Eastern European absolutism. While having some important similarities, it is in many ways different from French absolutism. Be prepared to compare the two, just as an FYI. Eastern absolutism was based on a powerful nobility, a weak middle class, and an oppressed peasantry composed of serfs. So you may already start to notice those key differences. For example, in France, the nobility's power had been limited, the middle class was relatively strong, and the peasants were generally free from serfdom. And so Louis XIV built French absolutism upon the foundations of a well-developed medieval monarchy and strong royal bureaucracy. So a key similarity then, because you may be thinking like, all right, this does sound pretty different, but the key similarity that fundamentally makes both of them absolute monarchies as opposed to constitutional is that in both situations there are no legislative bodies like a parliament or a states general or anything like that to limit the monarch's power. And so, as we look at the consolidation of power in Eastern Europe, basically, how did absolutism emerge? So, there was a pretty present threat of war with European and Asian invaders. And this threat of war was an important motivation for Eastern Europeans' monarchs' drive to consolidate power. Again, threat of war, especially with this idea that they could be invaded, that really encourages people to sort of stick together under one leader. And in some ways, this actually resulted in the reduced political power of the nobility because the nobility sort of banded together with the monarch to protect themselves. Think of sort of like the Viking threat in the Middle Ages and how that supported the development of feudal monarchies. It's kind of similar to that. And in this situation, the nobles actually gained much more power over the peasantry. We will see that that's actually like the deal that happens is the nobles give power to the monarch, but the monarch will allow the nobles to have more power over the peasantry. And there are really three important methods of gaining absolute power. Kings imposed and collected permanent taxes without the consent of their subjects. That is a pretty common tendency of absolute monarchs. Remember, that was something the Stuart monarchs did in England, and White Parliament got so upset with them. Also, these states began to maintain permanent standing armies that were loyal to the state. They were not reliant on the nobility. That's a big difference between these more modern absolute monarchs and, say, the feudal monarchies of the Middle Ages, where armies were ultimately associated with the nobility. That was what the whole system of feudalism. And also, states conducted relations with other states as they pleased. These monarchs ultimately represented the sovereignty of the state and could conduct foreign policy without the influence of the nobility. And absolutism in Eastern Europe ultimately reached its height with Peter the Great of Russia. And we will see that absolutism in Prussia is also stronger than absolutism in Austria. So when it comes to absolutism in Eastern Europe, the power rankings are essentially going to be Russia, Prussia, and then Austria.